So we saw the Passover meal being transformed by Jesus and his disciples into the Last Supper, where Jesus and his disciples shared a meal together in the presence of an enemy. And this morning we're going to continue in Luke 22, where we see both Peter and Jesus being tested. Gethsemane then becomes a place of crushing, of testing. In verse 31, we're seeing that they're still in the upper room. And Jesus warns Peter that a time of testing is going to come. And he calls him Simon. We know that Jesus already changed Simon's name to Peter, and he's been calling him Peter all this while. All of a sudden, Jesus begins to call him Simon, Simon. Maybe a portent or a prediction that perhaps things are not going to go so well. You see, Simon is still transitioning into Peter. Even though Jesus has changed his name, he hasn't fully become a Peter yet. And for all of us, I think that is true. When we receive salvation, we're transformed by Christ, but there's a process we go through growing into a place where we are more Christ-like, right? And so Peter is still transitioning. Eventually, he will be that rock on which Christ will build the church. And Satan here asks permission from Jesus if he could sift the disciples like wheat. Wheat in Israel, we've seen when the wheat is harvested, it's taken to a place called a threshing floor, which is a flat place, but usually on top of a higher location. The reason being that the Mediterranean breezes blow in. And after being threshed, the farmer will take a winnowing fork and he picks the wheat up and he throws it into the air, so all the chaff gets blown away by the breeze, and the grain of wheat falls to the ground so it can be collected and stored. And so when Satan is asking permission to sift the disciples, he wants to crush us, he wants to winnow and throw us in the air, hoping that we will abandon Christ and turn to him. But the thing with Satan is he always has to ask God's permission before he can test God's people. If you know the story of Job, that's what happens. God has asked for permission before Job could even be touched by Satan. And same here with Jesus' disciples. Peter is the chief of the disciples, the leader, the guy on the top, right? And so he is going to be tested first. And when he goes through this time of testing and when he emerges on the other side, then after being strengthened, he can strengthen his brothers, the other disciples. And that's the purpose. And Jesus tells Peter, Peter, I have prayed for you so that your faith will stand firm. And Peter, of course, we've begun to know him and love him as this big fisherman who's impetuous and impulsive, right? He says, no, Jesus, I'm ready to go to prison for you. I'm ready to die for you. The problem is that Peter still doesn't understand that Jesus is not leading a revolution. He doesn't need weapons and things like that. Peter's still thinking along the terms of a revolution. And so Jesus tells him, Peter, you are going to deny me 3 times before the cock crows in the morning. And Jesus tells his disciples, didn't I tell you not to take any money or a bag or sword with you when you went out to minister before? And didn't God provide for you everything you needed? Yes, God did provide for them. They don't have need to take any of these things. And Jesus quotes here from Isaiah 53:12. And this particular portion of scripture from verses 35 to 38 is only recorded by Luke. None of the other gospel writers talk about this. But Jesus quotes from Isaiah 53:12. I will give him the honors of a victorious soldier. Because he exposed himself to death, he was counted among the rebels. He bore the sins of many and interceded for the rebels. Jesus is referring to the 2 thieves who would be by his side at his crucifixion, of course. That's the obvious thing. But he's saying that the time has come for this prophecy to be fulfilled. He will be given the honors of a victorious soldier because he exposed himself to death. His dying is what makes him a victorious soldier. It's not about fighting with swords. Victory comes through suffering. And in 2 Corinthians 10:4, we see that the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds. So Jesus is again explaining to them, look, this is not about carrying swords and fighting a physical battle. This is about the battle in the spirit world and pulling down the strongholds of Satan. It's a different kind of battle. The battle that is fought through suffering and through death. But, Peter says, oh, we have two swords, right? Mm-hmm. And verses 39, they finally leave the upper room and they head to the Mount of Olives. Now, the arrow points from the upper room to the Mount of Olives, the green arrow. And of course, every time they left Jerusalem and went up the Mount of Olives, they always headed to Bethany. So the disciples assume that they are heading to Bethany, but Jesus doesn't go all the way to Bethany as usual, but he stops on the lower slope of the Mount of Olives between Jerusalem and Bethany in a place called the Garden of Gethsemane, marked in the purple in the map. And this is where Jesus stops. And in this place, in this Gethsemane, there's a church that is built, like I have mentioned before. Every place that is considered to be a place where something happened of significance in the Bible, they build a church over it. And actually, there are 3 churches all clustered close to each other because people thought, well, this is Gethsemane, that is Gethsemane. Mm-hmm. So they weren't quite all agreed, so they built 3 churches. And this is one of the most prominent ones that most people go to, the traditional location of the Garden of Gethsemane. The Mount of Olives rises steeply from the Kidron Valley, rises to about 300 feet above the city of Jerusalem. And there's a grove of olive trees. This particular garden is next to that church. And there are olive trees there, but also you can see the modern rose plants there. And this may not be the exact place of Gethsemane, but there are olive trees, and these olive trees are pretty old. There's one here that's all gnarly and held up by rocks, shows how old it is. But it's certainly not from the time of Jesus, because after the time of Jesus, the Romans cut down all these trees. So this is a later addition. It's still old, though. And Jesus stops there. This Gethsemane is a place, because they're olive trees, it's a place where they have equipment to process the harvested olives. And the processing area is called Gethsemane. The word Gethsemane in Hebrew or Aramaic is Gath Shemanim, which means oil press. And that's the term we get that from. And it's the location of Jesus' intense struggle in prayer. And it brings to mind the crushing process of the olives in a heavy stone press, kind of like this. These are 2 oil presses that in two different places in Israel that I photographed, and thought it would give you a better idea of what it looked like. A round stone, and on top of that would be another big round stone, heavy stones, and the olives are put in there, and then it's turned around and crushes the olives and produces the olive oil. It extracts the oil from the olives. And it serves to highlight the immense pressure that Jesus was under. It was both physical and emotional stress. Right. And Jesus knelt in prayer. At least Luke tells us he knelt in prayer. This is an art depiction of Jesus kneeling in prayer in that same church that I showed you. And it's on above the altar, and below there's a service going on, as you can tell. And outside, where the olive trees were, there's a stone area where in stone is carved another portrait of Jesus kneeling in prayer. And Jesus is under a lot of pressure, but Matthew's gospel tells us that he fell face down to the ground. So whether he was kneeling or face down to the ground, Jesus was feeling the pressure of what he was about to undertake. And so much pressure that the capillaries on his forehead burst and drops of blood mingle with his sweat and it drips down his brow. And I checked with Vic, it's a very possible medical scenario that could happen. So it's not something unusual, but it is under unusual circumstances, very stressful circumstances. And his emotional state is described as being sorrowful to the point of death. All the authors, all the gospel writers say it in different ways. One says sorrowful to the point of death. The other one says agony of spirit, distress, anguish. That's such a diverse language. It seems almost as if words are inadequate to describe the full extent of Jesus' suffering. Circumstances were dire, irreversible, and can only be captured best by the image of the oil press, the olive press, Gethsemane. Jesus is the Son of God, but in his humanity, he cries out to God saying, Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering for me. Yet I want your will to be done, not mine. Now, the extent of Jesus' struggle can only be understood by the options that geography gave Jesus. From Gethsemane, if he looked west, he would see the city of Jerusalem, right? That's where he should be going. That's where everything is going to happen. But if he turns east, to the east of him is the Judean wilderness. How easy it would have been to slip away into the Judean wilderness. Rugged, dry terrain, quiet, isolated, not a place that is welcoming for or being able to, where you could have farming. You can't grow anything there. It is not a place where cities could be built. It doesn't sustain people. So barren that it would be ideal for a fugitive to hide in these places. David, when he was chased by Saul, went into the wilderness to hide. But Jesus is no fugitive. If there was another way to save humanity, he would have turned east, away from the trumped up charges, the mockery, the beatings, the death on the cross. He could have escaped it all. That's right. But he chose differently. See, salvation is not an escape into the wilderness. It is a walk toward the cross. And that's where Jesus' destiny lies. Jesus' struggle in Gethsemane is a choice. It's a decision that was made not in his best interest, but in ours. Now, the disciples, of course, Jesus is setting an example for the disciples, but what are the disciples doing? They've fallen asleep. And Jesus wakes them up in verse 46 and says, get up and pray so that you won't give in to temptation. He knows what's ahead and he wants them to pray, but they keep falling asleep. They too have to make a choice. And so do we, right? We all have to make that choice. And prayer is the key to doing God's will, to choosing to do God's will and not our own. Choosing to do God's will can be tough. He takes us through difficult places. Sometimes we have to deal with difficult things. And prayer is the key to do his will. And suddenly the night is interrupted by Roman soldiers and the temple guard crashing and coming through the trees. And Judas meets Jesus, his old master, with a kiss of greeting and betrayal. This is another artwork depicting Jesus' kiss of betrayal, greeting. And you see behind Jesus the disciples, and in front of him, behind Judas, you see the soldiers. This is a dastardly deed done in the darkness of night. And the disciples' first response is, Jesus, we have those two swords. We should fight, right? And Peter takes out his sword and he cuts off the high priest's servant's right ear. And one of the Gospels, I believe it's John, tells us the name of the guy. His name was Malchus. And he cuts off his right ear. And Jesus says, stop, stop, stop. This is not what it's all about. You guys still don't understand. And then he reaches out and he touches the man's ear and it's healed. And of course, Jesus is arrested and taken away. There's no crowds there for support. And Jesus asked them, why are you coming in the cover of darkness with clubs and sticks and swords when you could have easily arrested me in the temple? I was there all the time, and you could have easily arrested me. But it's so that the power of darkness could reign. Only for a while, though, because God allowed it. It could not have happened if God did not allow it. Sometimes God allows a period of darkness in order to shine his light the best. In verse 54, Jesus is taken to the high priest's house. This is Caiaphas. Caiaphas was the high priest at that time. And this is the place, a possible location for the home of Caiaphas, at least the traditional location. And of course, they built a church there as well. But this was built and identified a long time ago. In more recent times, they found a complex of homes in the middle of Jerusalem, in the Jewish quarter, where they think might have been the high priest's home, Caiaphas' home, along with other ruling priests as well. And the reason being, these are elaborate homes, multiple rooms in there. And I don't know if you can read this, but it's the middle one, the biggest one, is Mark saying it's the mansion, possibly the high priest Caiaphas' home. And the reason why they think it could have been the priesthood is, one, they were wealthy people. They could afford those things. Remember, they were in cahoots with Rome. They had political positions. So they were wealthy. But the other reason is because that house was surrounded by cisterns and mikvahs, or the ritual baths, right? And who but the priests needed ritual baths and places where they could cleanse themselves, the purification rites that they would have to undergo before going to serve in the temple or doing other things. They had so many rituals that they had to do, and a lot of them involved cleansing in order to set themselves apart for God's service. And so it's very possible that this is the place where Caiaphas could have been. And this is the actual archaeological dig that exposed that place. And as you can see on the floor, you have mosaics. Only rich people could afford to have mosaics on their floor. So this was a pretty elaborate setup and very wealthy houses, perhaps for the priesthood, the elite of the priesthood to live in. And Peter finds his way into the courtyard, and there's a fire there, and he warms himself by the fire, trying to be inconspicuous. But he's recognized by a servant girl, and she comes and tells him, aren't you one of those disciples? And he says, no, I'm not. And then a little while later, another man comes and says, aren't you one of them? And he says, no. And an hour later, yet another man comes and says, you are a Galilean, you must belong with Jesus, and you must be part of them. And he says, no, denies it vehemently. And immediately he hears the cock crow. And Peter knows, he remembers right away what Jesus had said, the conversation he had had with Jesus. And he's ashamed of himself, and he repents immediately. He weeps bitterly, and he leaves the courtyard. And why would such a faithful disciple like Peter deny Jesus? There's two possible reasons for that. One, that he was easily recognizable as a Galilean. The Galileans were looked down on by the Judeans. The Judeans considered themselves city folk. They lived in Jerusalem. They had the big city of Jerusalem, and so they considered anyone from Galilee to be country hicks. And their perception of these rural Galileans was that they were too simple. They had no sophistication, and that they were very lax in their practice of their faith, because all they had was a synagogue, whereas the Judeans had Jerusalem and the temple with all the priests and all the formalities surrounding their worship. And so they thought they were the ones who were closest to God.
Mm-hmm.
And so when a Judean called someone a Galilean, it was derogatory. It was a criticism, right? And it was an insult. And Peter may have been offended. And he denied his Galilean heritage as well as denying Jesus. And then the second reason that's possible is the location, right? Peter was in the courtyard. Now, a courtyard, what would we normally think of a courtyard? Probably would be like a deck or a patio, right, outside the house. But that wasn't the case in Jewish homes. The courtyard was in the center of the house. This is the courtyard that Peter was in, and it's in the complex of that house, as you can see. And this is the church of Peter's denial, the church of Peter's Gallicantu. Gallicantu means Peter's denial, right? And this particular picture is an interpretation, or the artist's rendition, a model of what that complex would have looked like and what that particular house would have looked like. You see so many rooms around the courtyard. The courtyard is in the center where the arrow points to. And there's tons of rooms around and corridors leading here and there. And Peter was more used to a simple one-room house or a two-room house at the most, right? Most of the people, that's all they lived in. And they too would have had a courtyard, but the houses would have been clustered around the courtyard, but it's all one-room houses. And so it would have been an easy in and out he was familiar with. But here he was in this maze of rooms and corridors. And remember Peter's state of mind at that time. They'd just taken away Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
He's afraid for his life. He's following from a distance. He dared not go too close. And it's dark. It's nighttime. It's dark. And he's trying to keep his eyes on Jesus, and he wants to see where they're taking him. He wants to see what's going to happen to Jesus. And so he's following. I don't think he's paying attention to his surroundings. And somehow he finds himself in this corridor, in a place that he did not know, in a building that he did not know. How does he get out of this courtyard? How does he find his way out? Perhaps he's a little confused and not quite sure how to get out of there. Now, these reasons don't necessarily excuse Peter, but it helps us understand what led to his denial. And very early on the morning of Nisan 14, Nisan being the 7th month of the Jewish year, before anyone had gotten up from their festivities. Remember, this is Passover time, right? The Nisan 14 was Passover. Everyone has gathered in Jerusalem from all over the country. They're seeing their relatives, their loved ones, and they're partying and anticipating this great festival they're about to celebrate. So they might have been up late eating and drinking and tired, and so they sleep in. And this is very, very early in the morning, even before the dawn of any light. And Jesus is ushered into the high priest's house under cover of darkness, questioned by hastily gathered council, a council of the Sanhedrin. So who are these? What is this council and Sanhedrin? Well, they are the supreme Jewish religious, political, and legal council that existed in first century Israel. They consisted of the elders of families and tribes, leading priests and teachers of the law. And among them, the Sadducees held the majority seat. The Sadducees consisted of elders of the tribes as well as the leading priests. The Pharisees were the teachers of the religious law, and then there were the scribes who were the legal arm of the priesthood and religious council. So this was the Sanhedrin and the council of the Sanhedrin. And they were quickly gathered together and in order to hold court in Caiaphas's house, and they asked Jesus questions. Now, this particular council, they are in the right by questioning Jesus because they were in charge of making sure that someone who claimed to be the Messiah was truly the Messiah. because there were a lot of claimants, a lot of people claiming to be the Messiah in those days. And so they would question the person and make sure, okay, this guy is a Messiah or this guy is not a Messiah. And obviously no one had been the Messiah yet. And so they're questioning Jesus. So in that sense, they're right. And they ask him, are you the Messiah? And Jesus says, when I leave here, I'm going to be seated at the right hand of the power of God. Whoa, now that's a little too much for them to take, right? Sure. And immediately they think only the Son of God can sit next to God. And so they ask him, are you claiming to be the Son of God? And Jesus says, you said it, not me. He said, you say that I am. And even the words I am is a play on the Old Testament name of God, where when God told Moses to go to the Egyptians, to lead them out of Egypt, Moses said, who should I say sent me? Because they're not going to believe me. And God tells Moses, go tell them that I am has sent you. And Jesus is making a play on those words here. And immediately they get it, and they can't stand it, and they shout blasphemy. We don't need any more witnesses. He's condemned himself with his own mouth. And they condemn Jesus for claiming to be the Messiah, the Son of God. The real Messiah comes, and they don't recognize him. This is a kangaroo court, right? Assembled together in a hurry. And in the first century Israel, there were certain laws and procedures that they were to abide by. And Caiaphas had called them in the night, and he had violated the Mishnah, the laws, the established Jewish laws. According to the Mishnah, no trials could be held on festival days or Sabbath. And this was the week of Passover. They were celebrating a festival, one of the biggest festivals in Israel. They broke that law, and usually they are assigned a place where they're supposed to meet on the temple grounds. And they were in Caiaphas' house. That's not the place where they're supposed to meet. Meetings and trials could only take place during certain daylight hours. It was still dark when they met. And then they had to have adequate witnesses and public representation. They had no public representation, and they didn't have adequate witnesses. They were lucky if they found a few of the members of the council to come and meet with them. It was all done in a big hurry, completely illegal, in the darkness of the night, violated the law. This trial was a mockery. Right? It wasn't really a true and fair trial, not going according to the procedure of their own law. So Gethsemane, we see, is a place of crushing for Jesus. And it's a time when he weighs his option and still chooses death as his destiny. And for Peter also, this is a time of testing, which he failed initially, but he's quick to repent. This big, burly fisherman has such a soft heart that he repents immediately, right? Rough on the exterior, but soft in his heart. And one day he would be the leader of the Jerusalem church. So what does Gethsemane have to teach us? When we go through times of testing, when we feel like we are being crushed under the weight of whatever's happening to us, how do we respond? Jesus set an example for the disciples and for us. Whatever the test, whatever its outcome, then we have a need that we ought to stand firm in our faith, right? That's what marks us as followers of Christ. Our destiny is in God's hands, and he will carry us through the time of testing, time of crushing. We are in his hands, and we can leave our destiny in his hands and have that peace that passes all understanding, even in the midst of being pressed out like olives crushed to produce oil.